Welcome to Sputnik, orbiting the world with me, George Galloway.
And me, Gayatri.
For as long as the Palestinian struggle has existed, another gift to the world by collapsing British colonialism has blighted the subcontinent in Kashmir. And moreover, far more people have perished violently there as a result.
Two nuclear powers, India and Pakistan, confront each other across a line of control, both with fingers firmly on the button. Remarkably, however, not a lot of people know that.
Thus, the insult added to the injury suffered by the people of occupied Kashmir is that nobody much cares. One who does is my old friend, writer and broadcaster, Victoria Schofield, author of now the 4th edition of Kashmir in Conflict. And I'm glad to say she joins us now. Victoria, let's start with that point. How is it that when you write a book about Kashmir, people probably think you're writing about scarves?
Well, initially they did, but you can be assured I put them right very quickly. And I think what, for me, is tragic about the dispute over the former princely state, as it was, of Jammu and Kashmir, is that, in fact, my book is in its 4th edition. When I first wrote a book in the early 90s, I thought this would be a book and that the issue would eventually be resolved, but it hasn't been, and that's why I've been continually updating the book.
60 years, the biggest occupation force in the world today is in occupied Kashmir, Jammu and Kashmir, 500,000 Indian soldiers, 2 nuclear-armed powers, just a short ballistic flight apart, and a never-ending conflict. How come the world has allowed that?
Well, the difficulty, as we know, of any conflict, is it takes the aggrieved parties to sit down at the negotiating table and work out a resolution themselves. And this, unfortunately, hasn't happened. What you really need is a dialogue between India, Pakistan, and also the inhabitants of the state of Jammu and Kashmir. And one of the confusing and complex issues about Kashmir is that even now I use the word Jammu and Kashmir, but it is actually comprised of different regions, and those inhabitants have different aspirations. Not only in the Indian-administered side, as we call it, you have Jammu region, which is predominantly Hindu. You've got the Valley of Kashmir, where the main focus of disaffection arises, but you've got the vast area of Ladakh. These are Buddhists living there. So it's their aspirations also have to be taken into consideration. Across the line of control, you've got what are now called Gilgit-Baltistan, formerly the northern areas. These people are very different ethnically from the inhabitants of the valley. And then you've got the narrow strip of land as a Jammu and Kashmir, again with Suddans and Punchis, who don't actually have the Kashmiri language. So it's a complex issue, and it needs all the inhabitants to be allowed to sit down at the negotiating table. But so far, this hasn't happened.
Well, the world, of course, called for that in the United Nations Security Council, and moreover, the then great Indian Premier, Mr. Nehru, promised to abide by that resolution, which called for a plebiscite.
Yes, well, that was the plebiscite.
To self-determinate the future of the territory. The British, I'm right in saying, haven't I, were behind this, as so much. Upon withdrawing from occupied India, they allowed these princely states to decide whether they went with India or with Pakistan. And the Maharaja of this particular territory, against the wishes of the majority of his people, but by fiat, joined India.
Well, that was really, I mean, I think just going back a little bit, one of the biggest tragedies, and counterfactual history is never very satisfactory, but nonetheless sometimes it's interesting to look at it, is had the British insisted that the Maharaja take a decision before British authority ceased, we might not have seen the problems we've had, which have existed to the present day. And the fact that he didn't take a decision, he wouldn't take a decision initially, then you had a situation of warfare on both sides, and then he hurriedly took a decision, and it was the then Viceroy and Governor-General Lord Mountbatten who suggested that the issue should actually be resolved by a plebiscite, referendum, or reference to the people. Both rulers of India and Pakistan agreed to hold a plebiscite, but then the fact that the plebiscite was never held has left this unfinished business, unfinished feeling amongst some inhabitants that actually their future hasn't been resolved through as I say, a plebiscite or through the democratic process. Of course, the Indian government say, well, they've had elections, therefore that's tantamount to having had a plebiscite. But somehow you still have this festering idea that we were promised our right of self-determination and we haven't been given it.
So 500,000 Indian soldiers, as George described, as mentioned. Could you tell us a bit what the situation is like there?
Well, I mean, it's true. It's a very heavily fortified state. I mean, a lot of the soldiers actually are up on the border in the Ladakh area, and I've travelled through these regions as well. But what's very visible is a military presence when you go to Srinagar, the capital city of the Valley of Kashmir. Also, what's visible is the Indian military presence outside of Srinagar. Srinagar, in many respects, is not as heavily fortified as the outlying areas, for obvious reasons, because not a lot of foreigners, but some foreigners and the journalists come there. But the fact remains, for the number of militants, the number of people who took up arms against the Indian government, per capita, there are an enormous number. I mean, however the statistics work out, there are an enormous number of soldiers. And with the soldiers, obviously, comes acting with impunity. And this is what, if you go to the Valley of Kashmir, is very difficult. Whereas I might go as a British citizen, I might stop at a checkpoint, show my passport. But for Kashmiris, they constantly feel that they're under scrutiny. And then if there's some trouble or other, there'll be curfew, there'll be lockdown. And again, it's a very difficult sort of life to be leading. And I always feel, so privileged. We in the West, we take for granted. We have a passport, we can move about, we can go to Europe, we can go wherever we want. For an inhabitant of the Valley of Kashmir, they have to apply for a visa, they have to wait, sometimes they can't. And that's why I earnestly sort of wish for a resolution of the issue, because then people can lead normal lives, which is what everybody wants to do.
100,000 people have lost their lives, which is a staggering death toll. What used to be called a paradise on earth is pretty close to hell, isn't it?
Well, for a lot of people who live there, and I think when you mention the statistics of the dead, you have to also take into account, for example, a lot have disappeared, and that means that the wives, they don't know what's happened to their husbands. Consequently, they can't remarry. They're called half-widows. And the orphans. And what hasn't been assessed is the trauma. Especially when I went to Kashmir, when I started on the first book in the early 1990s, the sort of standard comment was there's not one single family in the Valley of Kashmir who hasn't lost a family member. And again, you have to take that into account for how people lead their lives. That said, they're also wanting, the same as we do. They want to have weddings. They want to have, sort of be able to visit their families. They want to be able to have the movement. And until the issue is resolved at a high political level, you're not going to see that freedom of movement. Well,
talking of high political levels, you and I were both privileged to be close personal friends of the late Benazir Bhutto. And the 36th anniversary of the judicial murder of her father, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, Prime Minister of Pakistan, is coming up. Murdered, of course, by a US pet general, Zia-ul-Haq. You were actually there in Pakistan when this dreadful deed was done, and indeed we're both going to be at a memorial function on the 4th of April on this. How does it feel now, 36 years later?
It's actually extraordinary. I mean, I've grown old with the issue, actually, which from which stemmed my interest in working on Jammu and Kashmir as well. In a way, it seems like yesterday, but also since that time, a whole life has been led by Benazir Bhutto, and now she's also been assassinated. And so it's with great sadness that I see this family who aspired to public duty, public service. And I think what I really feel is how very young Zulfikar Ali Bhutto was at that time. We were very young. In our 20s, and so we sort of thought he was senior and he'd been prime minister and he'd been president. But he was 49 when he was arrested. He was 51 when he was executed. And you feel, well, what a lot of potential was suddenly snuffed out. And I think what's particularly interesting in the present day is how much interest is being focused on Zulfikar Ali Bhutto. He was a modern man. He was a progressive man. And how different, again, with counterfactual history, the history of Pakistan could have been had he survived. I actually sat through the appeal against the death sentence. And I don't know whether, because we've got social media now and the internet, but whether such a thing could happen in the present day. Yeah. It's very interesting because for people who didn't quite understand the complexities of the case, he was accused of conspiracy to murder, not murder, conspiracy to murder. And I was recently reading someone's text the other day and they said accused of murder. And I said, no, you must change that. Conspiracy to murder, it's a totally different thing. There was one man who linked him with this firing at a roundabout in Lahore. More importantly, in a way, the verdict was split 4-3, and yet he was executed.
Despite the protests of...
And despite the protests and despite the international pleas for clemency. And it's just extraordinary to think that that could happen, that he was actually taken out and executed, and it was all so tawdry. And I do remember going to be able to see Benazir shortly, just 2 or 3 days before the sentence was carried out. And I sat with my friend from the Oxford days, and you know, what do you say to someone when you know their father's about to be taken out to be executed? It's the most appalling thing. And what I think one also must pay recognition to is how she picked herself up and didn't ever show a sort of a hatred. She moved forward from it. And she managed to...
She might have been consumed with revenge, but wasn't. I look forward to being at that memorial service. Not service, but memorial meeting, commemoration with you, Victoria Schofield. Thanks for joining us on the Sputnik. Coming up after the break, I and many others were well hacked off by the Rupert Murdoch empire's telephone habits. After the break, Peter Jukes, author of Beyond Contempt, tells us who did what to whom and how they mainly got away with it. Welcome back to Sputnik. I, like many thousands of others, had my telephone routinely hacked by the grubby practitioners of the low press. I was compensated and have more to come.
But the industrial-scale law-breaking by Mr. Murdoch's operation, then by the Mirror Group, has told us much about the collapsing credibility of British institutions. It is beyond contempt what was being done. Lives and relationships destroyed, paranoia engendered.
But in the most expensive trial in British history, in the case of the Murdoch Empire, only the minions were convicted. The despicable me's at the top were all as pure as the driven slush. Or were they? Joining us is the author of the book, Beyond Contempt, Peter Jukes. Peter, welcome to the Sputnik. Let's start with that last point that I made. They were all innocent, weren't they?
Well, there's the court of public opinion and there's a criminal trial. The burden of proof for the criminal trial is you have to be absolutely sure that, for example, Rebecca Brooks knew about Glenn Mulcair. Now, one could argue with £1 million contract over, 4 or 5 years, she bloody well should have known about Glenn Mulcair, but reaching that burden of proof to be absolutely sure, given 20 million emails were missing, and no live witnesses came forward to testify against her, you can understand that decision. Everywhere I go, though, in the court of public opinion, people aren't sure about that verdict. They go, even in Chipping Norton, where her friends live, how did she get off?
Now, the trial was the most expensive in British legal history, but the state, the prosecution, spent not that very much by comparison. Tell us, how heavily was the prosecution outgunned by Mr. Murdoch's expensive legal talent?
Well, it's an interesting moment when I discovered this too, because it tells you a lot about the British press, but I'll get to that. So towards the end of the trial, you're sitting around like in a sort of, I don't know, airport in the 1970s waiting for verdicts, and we went through the costs, and the amazing thing was that I discovered one defence barrister, QC, was being paid about £1,000 an hour. The prosecution barrister, Andrew Edis, was paid £1,000 a day. Juniors, pro rata the same. So you realise by a factor, because there were 6 defence teams and 1 prosecution team, about 12 to 1 outspent in the court itself. But then you've got to look, obviously, you've got to throw in the costs of the police investigation operation, Wheating, which was into the phone hacking and a bit of Elvedin into corrupt payments. So it works out about 25 million spent by the state, including everything, police,
including the
courts, defence. The court costs only about 1 or 2 million. Whereas News International spent, well, now News UK, about 80 million. I mean,
how many?
18 million pounds. Rebecca Brooks, when she is found not guilty, you can claim your costs back from the state. Technically, she came forward with a motion for 25 million just for herself. Now, as the judge said, well, if you're going to claim that, we might have to have disclosure about how much the company knew and corporate issues like that, and they didn't go for it.
They backed off.
They backed off. But that, just on the press thing, so I discovered this during, the 2 or 3 weeks waiting for a verdict with all these great journalists. Individually, the journalists covering court were fantastic. But the editorial line their papers took was, on the day of the verdict against Coulson, or the morning afterwards, they said, £100 million for one guilty verdict. What a waste of money. They did not say who spent that 100 million. And that of that, there was one guilty verdict that day. Of the 11 people indicted for phone hacking, 9 have pleaded or been found guilty. But both the the Times, the Telegraph, the Mail, and the Sun went for the same line. 3 big newspaper groups, exactly the same line, about 100 million for one
This
verdict.
is to intimidate the state from embarking upon any further prosecutions.
And also about press regulation and the power of, yes, the newspapers have felt they can run the state and scare police and scare judges. The Sun has a campaign against the CPS now. Odd that, there are a lot of Sun trials going on. And I'm a great believer in the freedom of the press and the balance of powers. But when there's newspapers, which are corporations, think they're more powerful than the state and the police, that is worrying. Because you can't vote them out.
Now, in your fantastic book, Beyond Contempt, which was crowd-funded, tell us a bit about that. But you describe it as not just court reporting, though Nick Davis, the man who led the way on this story, describes it on the sleeve as brilliant court reporting, which, considering you were never a court reporter, is quite a compliment. But you describe it, or your publishers do, as a kind of walk through culture in Britain in the 21st century. What do they mean by that?
Well, I mean, this is what they say, evolution is a series of successful accidents. I didn't mean it to be this way, but I'm a dramatist, just happened to be at the right place at the right time, so that I started tweeting, everybody followed me, all the news feeds, all the police. Tom Waters said everybody's watching my feed on Parliament, all the lawyers and the defendants while in court. You're in court saying something and they're watching your Twitter feed. So in that way, maybe my dramatic heart found a very interesting moment in British culture, which tells you a lot about, the relative powers of the state, of the culture of the press, of the police. And I'd never been to a full trial. I'd popped in and out. I'd seen a lot of TV dramas. It's nothing like TV dramas. No. Most of the interesting stuff happens pre-trial or, away from the jury. Amazing process and, in a way lucky just to find myself in the storm of this, eye of this particular hurricane.
Now, what about the crowdfunding part of the book?
Yeah, well, that's what happened was I worked for the Daily Beast. I'd done a previous book about the phone hacking scandal and the Murdoch family's 100-year history called Fall of the House of Murdoch. And I went there just to really update the book. Started live tweeting as things happened and the affair came out and my Twitter feed went like that. And I said, sorry guys, Daily Beast couldn't pay me a retainer. I can't come here after the opening, after 4 days of the opening. And people said, you've got to stay. I said, well, I can't afford it. Somebody sent me, and I didn't know you could do this, £10 to my email address on PayPal. And so I was persuaded the next morning to offer to crowdfund it. They crowdfunded it in a few hours, and I came back. Now, the thing about that...
So you raised the money to cover the entire trial through crowdfunding. That's unique.
Yeah, I think for a court like that. And also, I think the thing that really interested the people was that it was about the media, and I wasn't in anybody's pocket. Yeah. I was in their pocket. So, either side, I wasn't working for News UK, the Telegraph, or the BBC, or the Guardian, all could be seen to have agendas. They were my employer. The other thing is, people paid sometimes quite a large amount of money. Total amount raised, I mean, this is gross, about 20 grand. for me to provide it free to other people.
Now, the point I made at the beginning about the collapsing credibility of British institutions is you've been talking about the media, the courts, and the police, just in this short interview. In the last week, the police, in the form of Duckenfield, the man who admitted that his negligence led to the deaths of 96 people at Hillsborough, even though they'd spent the last 20-odd years denying it and seeking to blame the victims. The police's credibility shot through. 4 judges were sacked because they were found to have been looking at pornography on their court computers. And the media, well, what is there to say about it in its credibility that hasn't already been said? One after another, British institutions are reduced somehow in the public's mind, aren't they?
I mean, I'm an optimist, and I suppose the dark light shone by a lot of this, particularly at the heart of this, the Daniel Morgan murder. The dark arts begin, it's a long story, in this private investigator who was murdered, associated with News of the World, associated with police corruption. It has shocked me. I do think, interesting you mentioned Hillsborough, one could mention the Savile case as well. It's the power of media over some institutions like the police. Now, obviously, there's always been police corruption. We know the Met, you know, Operation Countryman. Why do things take so long to come out? The Sun had a big place in the lies about the Hillsborough victims. And I think most police corruption cases take about 15 years to come out. The Daniel Morgan murder, panel inquiry, like Hillsborough, reporting in a year and a half, it's taken 30 years to come out. Why? Because there's a combination, what I think Gordon Brown said, a criminal media nexus has existed between the power of the press and the media to make and break politicians and make and break policemen. Really interesting. News of the World hacking. I've looked at the pattern of it. A lot of Home Secretaries. We had Blunkett and then Clark hacked sequentially. You had senior police officers, I'm not sure Stevens, but Heyman, Yates, and all these people failed to investigate phone hacking when it happened. Why? Because they saw that Rebecca Brooks or Andy Coulson or other senior journalists were close to the Home Secretary. You're a police officer, you're answering to them. And I think it's not when corruption happens, it penetrates certain veins, comes certain ways. It's not quite good enough to say it's there. You've got to find out how it happened. And I think that's pretty unique in Britain, that it comes from the media.
The antidote, of course, is the new media that we have. We're no longer dependent on Rupert Murdoch, or still less on the Mirror Group, which is hardly worth the paper it's written on. All these newspapers are losing money, losing readers, and losing credibility amongst those who are still reading them. They're doomed, aren't they? The last editor of The Sun will one day be strangled by the last edition of The Sun.
I'm not sure about how quite, I think you're talking metaphorically. Now, the fascinating thing, isn't it? I mean, I notice I get attacked a lot on Twitter by senior journalists from The Sun and other newspapers. I go, well, I'm just a bloke on Twitter. I have 15,000 followers. I don't have 2 million readers. Why do they care about me? They are terrible at social media. They're terrible at dialogue. And people don't understand about free speech now with social media. Free speech is a dialogue. It's not a megaphone where you press a lever up there as an editor and all these millions of copies come out and people just accept it. Rupert Murdoch replied to me the other day directly about the Salzburgs. And it's incredible. I mean, unfortunately, the organisations which own social media, and the internet is pretty monopolistic too.
Yes,
yeah.
Although we might find alternatives to that. Watch this space. Peter Jukes, thanks very much indeed for joining us on the Sputnik. And now it's your turn to tell us what you think through the portals of social media. What's rattling, Gayatri?
Well, Sean Caden says, Kashmir, one of the great shameful occupations of this or any time. The people are heroes, one and all. And Richard Thine says that it would not be remotely surprising if phone hacking, like other such scandals, was more widespread than we'll ever get to know.
Well, more and more of it is coming out. I myself will be in court in the medium term against the Mirror Group, who, it turns out, were doing exactly the same to me and many, many others as they were doing at The Sun and the News of the World.
That's all that we've got time for this week.
It's been marvellous.